She was standing at the altar in a dress that cost more than her mother's house. 600 people were watching. The flowers were perfect. The chandeliers were perfect. Everything was perfect. And then, in front of God and every important person in New York City, the man she was about to marry leaned close to her ear and whispered 3 words that would change both of their lives forever. He said, "My heart belongs to someone else." And then he walked away. But here's what nobody in that cathedral knew, not one single person, not even her. Those words were not a rejection. They were a confession. And the truth behind them would take months to surface, and when it did, it would break your heart before it put it back together again. Stay with me, because this story goes somewhere you are not expecting. If you have never heard a love story that starts with public humiliation and ends with a man who forgot how to feel learning to feel again, then you are in exactly the right place. And if this is your first time here, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because we tell stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Amy Reed. She was 24 years old, and she was, by every practical definition of the word, being sold. Not in the brutal, historical sense. No chains, no auction block. But in the quiet, suffocating way that happens when a father loses everything at a card table and his family becomes the collateral. Her father had debts. Serious debts. The kind that come with consequences that don't get filed in a courtroom. And her brother had made the kind of mistake that lives in the gray space between poor judgment and a prison cell. Amy had known for months that something was coming. She just didn't know it would come in the form of a black envelope, a brief meeting in a very expensive office, and a man with storm gray eyes who looked at her the way you look at a contract clause you're not thrilled about but are willing to accept. His name was Max Green. He was 34. He was tall, dark-haired, and had the kind of face that made people instinctively take a step back without knowing why. He ran an organization that operated in the deep, unlit corridors of money and power, the kind of organization that people knew existed but never spoke about directly. He needed one thing from this marriage: the appearance of a normal life. Certain associates, certain rivals, certain very traditional men of influence expected a man of his stature to be settled. To have a wife. A home. A reason to be careful. Amy would be that reason, on paper. She agreed. Not because she wanted to, but because she loved her father and her brother more than she feared this man. She told herself she could handle it. She told herself it was just a transaction, that she would live in his house, attend his events, smile in his photographs, and in return, her family would be protected. She told herself she would not feel anything. She was wrong about that last part. But she didn't know that yet on the morning of the wedding, when she stood in front of a full-length mirror in a hotel suite while 3 stylists adjusted her veil and she tried to remember how to breathe. St. Bartholomew's Cathedral in Midtown Manhattan was not a subtle venue. It seated 600 and it was full. Every pew packed with people dressed in designer everything, their faces arranged into expressions of admiration and careful neutrality, because nobody in that room wanted to be the person who reacted wrong in front of Max Green. The organ played. Her father walked her down the aisle, and she could feel the tremor in his arm, the fine vibration of fear that he was trying to hide. She squeezed his hand once. He couldn't squeeze back. They reached the altar and he let go. Max stood there the way he always stood. Perfectly still. Shoulders squared. Jaw set. He watched her approach with those gray eyes that gave away absolutely nothing, and she thought, this is what I have agreed to. This is the weather I will live inside. The vows were spoken. His voice was flat, mechanical, like a man reading the terms of a legal agreement out loud. Her voice shook slightly, but she made it through. And then the priest smiled and said those 7 words that are supposed to be the most joyful moment in a ceremony. You may now kiss the bride. Amy turned to face him. She rose up slightly on her toes. She tilted her chin. She closed her eyes. And Max Green stepped back. Not subtly. Not with a gentle turn of the cheek or a brief awkward pause. He took a full, deliberate step backward, and the space between them became something visible, something that had weight. 600 people watched it happen. And then he leaned forward, just slightly, and whispered 4 words into her ear. 4 words that the first 3 rows heard perfectly in the cathedral's acoustic silence. My heart belongs to someone else. A gasp moved through the church like a wave. Amy didn't move. She stood there, lips slightly parted, bouquet trembling in both hands, and she felt something inside her chest crack. Not break, not yet, but crack the way a wall cracks before it falls. Max walked away from the altar. His men fell into step behind him like shadows. And Amy stood alone in front of 600 people in a gown that cost more than her mother's house, and she had never felt so completely, totally, utterly alone in her life. The reception happened anyway because that is the kind of world Max Green operates in. The world does not stop because of pain. It just keeps moving and expects you to keep moving with it. Amy changed out of her gown at some point. She smiled at the right moments. She shook hands. She made it through the evening on something that was part adrenaline, part stubbornness, and part the particular kind of numb that sets in when your body decides that feeling everything would be too expensive right now. Late that night, she arrived at the Green estate. It sat on 12 acres above the Hudson River. Stone and iron and old money disguised as a home. A housekeeper named Dolores met her at the door, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and careful hands, and led her through hallways that smelled of wood polish and something older, something that had been accumulating for decades. "Your room is this way, Mrs. Green?" Amy noticed she said your room. Not your suite. Not your shared space. Your room. Mr. Green's quarters are in the east wing. Separate wings. Amy almost laughed. She had expected distance. She had not expected it to be architectural. The room was beautiful. Cream walls, a canopy bed, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. Her bags were already there. Someone had placed fresh flowers on the nightstand. It was a lovely cage. She sat on the edge of the bed in her gown and stared at her own reflection in the dark window, and the girl staring back looked like a stranger, someone wearing a costume, playing a role she hadn't rehearsed. And then there was a knock at the door. She expected Dolores. It was Max. He had changed into a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she noticed for the first time the tattoo that climbed from his wrist and disappeared beneath the fabric. He did not apologize. He did not greet her. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has decided that directness is the only courtesy he is willing to offer. "I want to be clear about something." She looked at him. "You were clear enough at the altar," she said. And she surprised herself with how steady her voice was. Something moved in his eyes. Surprise. Or something adjacent to respect. He told her the terms. Her family's debts were gone. Her brother was protected. In return, she would live here, attend events with him as required, and she would not ask questions about his business. He would get an image, the appearance of a settled life. "And that's it," she said. "That's it," he said. She studied him for a long moment. Behind the control, behind the cold, she thought she saw something else. A tiredness so deep it had stopped being exhaustion and become something more like a way of existing. "You could have told me this before the wedding," she said. "Before I stood in front of 600 people and was humiliated." He paused. "You're right," he said. Then he turned and walked away. No explanation. No apology. Just the sound of his footsteps, steady and unhurried, down the dark hallway. The sound of a man who believes he owes the world nothing. Amy pressed her back against the closed door and breathed. And out and out. She told herself she would not cry. She told herself she had survived worse. Her mother's death when she was 19. Her father's slow collapse into addiction and debt. Her brother's arrest. She had held all of it and stayed standing. She would hold this too. She was right. But she didn't know yet what holding it would cost her. In the weeks that followed, Amy learned the rhythms of the Green estate the way a shipwrecked sailor learns the tides, carefully and out of pure necessity. Max left before dawn most mornings. He returned late, sometimes not at all. When he was home, he occupied the east wing like a ghost, present but untouchable. They shared meals occasionally, sitting at opposite ends of a dining table built for 20, eating in a silence that had texture to it, that pressed against the air like a fourth presence in the room. Amy refused to disappear into the furniture. She started in the kitchen. She learned the names of the gardeners. She brought coffee to the security team during their overnight shifts. She asked Marco, Max's driver, about his daughter's school recital, and the following week she remembered to ask how it went. Marco looked at her like she'd said something in a language he'd forgotten he used to speak. "Nobody asks us things like that," he told her one morning, his voice careful, as though kindness was a trap this house had trained him to avoid. "Maybe they should," Amy said. One evening she found Dolores crying in the pantry, crouched between shelves of canned tomatoes and dried pasta, trying to cry quietly in the way that people do when they've had years of practice hiding their pain in other people's houses. Her grandson had been sick for weeks. The medical bills were piling up. Dolores had been managing Max's home for 11 years, and she had never asked for a single thing. Amy sat down on the floor beside her and listened. Not to fix it. Not to offer solutions. She just listened. The next morning, Amy walked into Max's study. He was on the phone, speaking in low, clipped words that made the air in the room feel different, denser, like the atmosphere before lightning. When he saw her, he ended the call without a word to whoever was on the other end. He just looked at her. Dolores's grandson needs surgery, Amy said. The family can't afford it. She has worked for you for 11 years. She runs your house. She knows your secrets. And she is currently crying in the pantry because she cannot pay her grandson's medical bills. Max stared at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes shifted. A recalculation, like a machine adjusting its output to account for a variable it hadn't included in its original equation. I'll handle it, he said. The surgery was scheduled within 48 hours. Top hospital. Best surgeon. Everything covered. Dolores found out and wept. She looked at Amy with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and something that looked almost like awe. Max never mentioned it again. But Amy noticed that later that week he came to dinner on time. And when he sat down he said, "Good evening." It was almost nothing. But in that house, almost nothing was everything. She found the photograph by accident. She was looking for a book in the library, a real library 2 stories high, brass rails and rolling ladders and first editions behind glass. She pulled a volume from a high shelf and a photograph fell out, drifting to the floor the way things drift when they've been hidden a long time and the hiding is finally over. It was a woman. Dark hair, dark eyes, a smile so luminous it seemed to generate its own light. She was sitting on a park bench, laughing at something just outside the frame. Whoever had taken the picture had done so with the kind of attention that only comes from love. Amy turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that was sharp and angular, Max's handwriting, she recognized it by then, 2 words. Always Natalia. She put the photograph back. But the name stayed with her. It was Marco who eventually told her. Not all at once. In fragments, offered carefully over weeks, the way someone feeds a fire they're not entirely sure they should be building. Natalia Svino. She had been Max's world. They met when he was 26, when he was still climbing, still hungry, still capable of softness he hadn't yet learned to seal away. She was a first-grade teacher in the village. She had no idea who he was when they first talked at a coffee shop. She made him laugh. Nobody made Max Green laugh. They were together 3 years. He was going to leave the organization for her. He had a plan, a timeline, an exit. He was going to become someone worthy of her. And then a rival family found out about her. Marco's voice went quiet when he reached this part of the story, and Amy understood that some details would never be spoken aloud. What she pieced together was this. Natalia was taken to send a message. Max got her back but not in time. She died in a hospital 3 days later. And something in Max died with her. He blames himself, Marco said. He believes that loving her is what killed her. And since then, he has made sure that no one gets close enough for it to happen again. Amy sat with this knowledge for days. She carried it carefully, the way you carry something fragile through a dark room. She didn't bring it up with Max. She didn't try to analyze it or offer comfort. She simply understood. And understanding it changed the shape of everything she saw. The coldness wasn't cruelty. It was armor. The distance wasn't indifference. It was fear. And the words he had whispered at the altar, "My heart belongs to someone else," were not a rejection of her. They were a confession. A declaration of grief so deep and so total that he had built his entire life around it like a monument. The shift happened the way dawn happens, so gradually that you can never name the exact moment the darkness became light. Max started noticing things. Small things. The way Amy spoke to people. Not with the performative kindness of someone trying to be liked, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually cared. The way the house felt different since she arrived, warmer somehow, as though she had changed the actual temperature of the air. He noticed that the staff smiled more. That Dolores hummed while she worked. That even his men, hardened, scarred men who had done things that would keep most people awake for the rest of their lives, softened slightly in Amy's presence, as though she was a frequency they had forgotten they could receive. One evening he came home earlier than usual and found her in the kitchen teaching Marco's 12-year-old daughter to make empanadas. The girl was covered in flour, laughing so hard she could barely stand. Amy was laughing with her. Really laughing, the kind of unguarded full-body laughter that fills a room and spills out into the hallway. Max stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there. And something inside his chest moved. A muscle that had been locked in place for so long he had forgotten it existed. The following week he did something he hadn't done in years. He ate breakfast at the main table. Not at his desk at 5 in the morning. At the actual table at a normal hour, where Amy was already sitting with coffee and the newspaper. She looked up surprised. She said nothing. She simply poured him a cup and slid it across the table. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the cold, punishing silence of the early weeks, but something more like peace. Like two people who have stopped being enemies and are not yet sure what they are becoming. The garden looks different, he said eventually. I asked Eduardo to plant herbs near the kitchen, Amy said. I hope that's okay. Pause. It's fine. Another silence. Then, Dolores told me what you did for her grandson. Amy looked at him. You're the one who paid for it. He looked back at her. You're the one who noticed. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her, and she held it gently, the way she held everything in that house, without grasping, without expectation, with the patience of someone who has learned that the most fragile things must never be clutched. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Amy was returning from the city. She had started volunteering at a literacy program downtown, something Max's security team had grudgingly approved after weeks of threat assessments and background checks. She was in the back of the SUV when it happened. Two black sedans, no plates, military precision, cutting them off on the highway. Marco reacted instantly. He threw the car into reverse and radioed for backup. Amy was pushed to the floor. She heard gunshots, sharp, percussive sounds, wrong sounds, the kind that don't belong in the world of normal people. The rear window shattered above her. Glass rained into her hair. The backup arrived in 4 minutes. The sedans disappeared. Marco had a graze on his shoulder that he refused to acknowledge. When they arrived at the estate, Max was standing in the driveway. His face was stone. But his hands were shaking. Amy had never seen his hands shake. It was past midnight when he came to her room. She was in the armchair by the window, a blanket around her shoulders, still picking glass from her hair. Are you hurt? His voice was controlled, but under the control was something raw, like a wound covered with a bandage that wasn't quite holding. I'm fine. You're not fine. You have glass in your hair. Then I'm mostly fine. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, closer than he had been since the altar. She could see the tension in his jaw, the muscle working under the skin. He was furious, not at her but at the situation, at the world, at whatever force had dared to reach into his sphere and touch something inside it. This is what I am, he said quietly. This is the world I live in. People around me get hurt. People around me. He stopped. The sentence had a destination he couldn't reach. I know what you're going to say, Amy said. You're going to say that this is why you keep everyone at a distance. That caring about someone is a liability. That what happened today proves you were right to build walls. He looked at her and for the first time his guard was down. Not all the way. Not all at once. But enough that she could see the man behind the mask. He looked exhausted. He looked haunted. He looked like someone who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that his body had molded itself around the weight. It does prove it, he said. No, Amy said gently. It proves your world is dangerous. It doesn't prove you have to face it alone. He said nothing. He sat for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the door. But before he left, he paused. Without turning around, he said, I'm glad you're safe. The door closed. Amy pressed her hand against her chest and felt her own heartbeat, fast and certain, and she understood with a clarity that took her breath away that she was beginning to fall in love with this broken, impossible man. 3 days after the attack, Max invited her to his study. It was the first time she had been inside. Dark mahogany panels, shelves lined with books he had actually read, a desk the size of a small island, and on the wall behind it, a painting, the Italian coast, golden light on blue water. He remained standing by the window, his silhouette framed against the evening sky, and he said her name. And then, her name was Natalia. Amy didn't tell him she already knew. She just listened. And he spoke for nearly an hour. He told her about the coffee shop in the village. About the way Natalia argued with him about everything. Politics, movies, whether to put sugar in espresso. About the apartment they shared in Brooklyn, how she filled it with plants she couldn't keep alive and books she read aloud to him at night. About the plans they made. About the morning he woke up and realized he loved her more than his own survival. And then he told her about the end. His voice didn't break. Max Green's voice was not built for breaking. But it became something else. Thin and stripped, like a wire pulled so tight it had started to hum. I held her hand in that hospital room for 3 days, he said. And I promised her I would never let it happen again. I promised her I would never put someone in a position where loving me could get them killed. He turned from the window and looked at Amy with eyes that were, for the first time, completely open. That's why I said what I said at the altar. It wasn't about you. It was about a promise I made to a dead woman in a hospital room 8 years ago. Amy felt tears on her cheeks and she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. Max, she said softly, keeping that promise doesn't honor her. It just means her death controls you forever. He flinched. It was barely visible, a micro-movement that most people would have missed entirely. But Amy saw it, and she knew she had touched something that no one had been allowed to touch in a very long time. She loved you, Amy continued. And if she loved you, she wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want you locked in a house full of people who are afraid of you. Married to a stranger you can barely look at. Living like you're already dead. The room was so quiet she could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. You don't know what she would have wanted, Max said. But his voice had no edge. It was just sound. Just words falling into the space between them. Maybe not, Amy said. But I know what you deserve. And it's more than this. She stood. She walked to the door. She paused just as he had paused at her door 3 nights before. Thank you for telling me, she said. Thank you for trusting me with her. She left. And in the dark study, with the painting of the Italian coast on the wall behind him, Max Green pressed his hands flat against his desk and bowed his head and felt something shift inside him. Something tectonic. Something that had been locked and sealed and buried for 8 years, finally beginning to move. After that night, the architecture of their relationship changed. Max started joining her for meals, not just breakfast but dinner too. The conversations were halting at first, like 2 people learning to walk after a long illness, testing each step before committing their weight. He asked about her volunteering. She asked about his day, carefully skirting the edges of his work, and he answered more than she expected. He began leaving his study door open when she was home. She began bringing him tea in the evenings, not because he asked but because she noticed he forgot to eat and drink when he was working. He never thanked her. But the cup was always empty when she collected it. One night, a storm knocked out the power across the entire estate. They ended up in the library by candlelight and they talked for 4 hours. He told her about his mother, who died when he was 12. She told him about hers, who died when she was 19. In the geography of their grief, they found a shared landscape. You're not what I expected, Max said at some point, watching her in the flickering light. What did you expect? Someone who would fold. Someone I could ignore until this arrangement served its purpose and ended. Sorry to disappoint, Amy said. And something happened that neither of them expected. Max laughed. A real laugh. Brief and rusty, like a machine that hadn't run in years, but real. Amy stared at him in the candlelight with his guard completely down and that unexpected sound still hanging in the air, and he looked like a different person. Younger. Less carved from stone. You should do that more often, she said. Do what? Laugh. It suits you. He looked away. But she caught the faintest trace of something on his face, not quite a smile but the memory of one. The blueprint of something that might, given enough time and enough courage, become the real thing. The power came back an hour later. Neither of them moved to turn on the lights. The federal investigation had been building for months. Wiretaps, informants, a grand jury assembling behind closed doors. Max's lawyer delivered the news on a Friday afternoon. Several of his top men were going to be arrested. The organization would survive, but the legal exposure was significant. And what the lawyer didn't know, what no one knew except Max and a very small circle, was that the investigation had been accelerated by a leak from inside. Someone trusted. Someone close. For 3 days the estate became a war room. Max barely slept. Amy watched from the edges, bringing food that went uneaten, coffee that went cold. She could see him unraveling, not visibly, never visibly, but in the micro details. The way his sentences got shorter. The way his jaw tightened until she could see the bones beneath his skin. On the 3rd night, she found a document on the hallway floor outside his study. It had been dropped by someone in a hurry. A printed email, heavily redacted, but with enough visible text for Amy to piece together what was happening. The evidence was pointing toward Dominic Kessler, Max's second in command. A man who had been with the organization for 15 years. Amy knew Dominic. He had been one of the few people in this world who had treated her like a person rather than a piece of furniture. He had shown her photographs of his children. He had told her once that Max was a better man than he let anyone see. She knew what happened to people in Max's world who were identified as leaks. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her room and weighed what she was about to do, understanding that it could destroy everything. The fragile trust she had built. The precarious safety of her position. Possibly her life. In the morning she went to Max's study. His eyes were red-rimmed. Dangerous. Before you do anything about the leak, she said, I need you to promise me something. He looked at her with the expression of a man who doesn't make promises. Make this one, she said. Promise me you'll hear the full truth before you act. Because I found something last night. And if I give it to you and you react the way everyone expects you to react, someone might die who doesn't deserve to. The silence stretched until it had weight. You're protecting someone, he said. I'm protecting you, she said, from making a decision you can't take back. She told him about the document. She told him what she suspected, that the evidence against Dominic had been planted, that someone else was behind the leak and was using it to eliminate a rival. She laid it out calmly, logically, with the quiet precision of someone who has spent her entire life solving problems that other people created. Max listened. When she finished, he picked up the phone and made 3 calls. Within hours, the truth emerged. A lower-level operative named Salazar had been feeding information to the feds in exchange for a reduced sentence on unrelated charges, and he had planted evidence against Dominic to cover his tracks. Dominic was cleared. The situation was handled. That night, Max found Amy in the garden. She was sitting on the bench near the herbs she had planted, wrapped in a coat, looking at the stars. You risked everything today, he said. It was the right thing to do. In my world, the right thing gets people killed. Then maybe your world needs better people in it. He sat beside her on the bench. It was the closest they had ever been, shoulder to shoulder, their breath visible in the cold November air. For a long time neither spoke. And then Max said very quietly, I was wrong about you. I know, Amy said. And for the second time he laughed. Softer this time. More real. And Amy felt the sound move through her like warmth, like sunlight finding its way through a crack in a wall that had stood far too long. The confession happened on an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn. No crisis. No danger. No dramatic catalyst. Just the trees along the Hudson burning gold and red, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Amy was in the library reading. Max came in to find a book, or that was what he told himself. In truth, he had been finding reasons to be in whatever room she was in for weeks now, circling her orbit like a planet that had been trying to escape a sun and had finally stopped pretending it wanted to. The biography section is that way, she said, pointing toward the east wall without looking up from her book. He stopped. How did you know I was looking for a biography? You always read biographies. You like knowing how other powerful men handled impossible situations. He sat down across from her. The chair was close, closer than the dining table, closer than the garden bench. Close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Amy, he said. Her name in his mouth sounded different, heavier, more deliberate, as though he were testing its weight on his tongue for the first time. I need to say something. And I need you to let me finish before you respond. She closed her book. When I married you, he said, I treated you like a transaction. An item on a ledger. I told myself that was all you could ever be, all anyone could ever be, because the alternative was too terrifying. The alternative meant opening a door I had welded shut 8 years ago. He paused. His hands were clasped together, knuckles white, and she could see the physical cost of this. The toll that vulnerability was taking on a man who had built his entire identity on invulnerability. But you, he shook his head slightly as though arguing with himself. You didn't accept the terms. You didn't shrink. You didn't become invisible. You walked into my house and you changed it. You changed the people in it. Another pause. You changed me. Amy's throat tightened. She said nothing. Exactly as he had asked. I told you at the altar that my heart belonged to someone else. And for a long time that was true. Natalia had my heart. I thought she would always have it because keeping it with her meant I never had to risk losing it again. He looked at her then. Really looked at her. With all his defenses stripped away. His gray eyes open and unguarded and terrified. But I was wrong. My heart isn't in that hospital room anymore. It's not buried with her. It's been moving, slowly, stubbornly, the way everything moves in my world. And it's come to rest somewhere I never expected. His voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. It's with you, Amy. My heart is with you. And I have no idea what to do with that because the last time I loved someone she died for it. And the thought of that happening to you is the only thing in this world that truly frightens me. The library was completely still. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Amy stood. She crossed the space between them and knelt in front of his chair, placing her hands over his clenched fists. His hands were trembling. Max, she said. Loving someone didn't kill Natalia. Evil people killed Natalia. And hiding from love for the rest of your life doesn't make you safe. It just makes you lonely. I can't lose you, he said. And his voice cracked. Finally, irrevocably cracked. The sound of a dam breaking, releasing 8 years of grief and guilt and terror into the space between them. Then don't push me away, she whispered. He unclenched his hands and took hers. His grip was firm but gentle. The grip of a man who is holding something precious for the first time in a very long time, and is terrified of breaking it. He pressed his forehead to hers. They stayed like that, breathing together. And in the silence, Amy heard something she had never heard from him before. A sound so soft it was almost imaginary. A release of breath that might have been a sob. Or might have been the sound of a man finally letting go. 6 months later, Max Green did something that shocked every person who had ever known him. He threw a party. Not a business gathering. Not a strategic dinner. Not the kind of cold, transactional event that his world required. A real party. In the garden Amy had replanted, under string lights she had insisted on, with music and laughter and food that Dolores and her team had been preparing for 3 days and refused to let anyone help with. The guest list was small but significant. Marco and his daughter, Dominic and his family, the security team, the gardeners, the people who made up the quiet, essential infrastructure of Max Green's life. The people Amy had spent months getting to know, one conversation at a time. Max stood at the edge of the garden in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, no jacket, no tie, and watched. Amy was across the garden, laughing with Marco's daughter, who was demonstrating a dance move she had learned at school. Dominic appeared beside him with a glass of whiskey. "I have known you 17 years, Dominic said. "And I have never seen you look like that." Max didn't take his eyes off Amy. "Like what?" "Like you're actually alive." Later, when the music was winding down and the candles were guttering in their holders, Max stood in the center of the garden and asked for everyone's attention. The conversations fell quiet. Eyes turned toward him, cautious and curious, still carrying the residual wariness that came with being in Max Green's orbit. Amy stood near the rose bushes, watching him with an expression of pure surprise. "Most of you were at my wedding," Max said. His voice was steady, but Amy could hear the current running beneath it. The effort, the vulnerability, the price of this moment. "And most of you saw what happened there. I made a choice that day to keep my heart locked away, because I believed it was the only way to survive in this world." He looked at Amy. "I was wrong." He crossed the garden and stood before her. The string lights cast a warm glow on his face. "You walked into this house as a stranger," he said, "and you changed everything. You made this place a home. You gave these people," he gestured to the crowd around them, "your kindness, your attention, your courage. You saved a man who didn't know he needed saving. And you did it without asking for anything in return." He took her hand. "I stood at an altar and told you my heart belonged to someone else. Tonight, in front of everyone who matters to me, I want to say the truth." His voice dropped, but the garden was perfectly quiet and every word was clear. "My heart belongs to you, Amy. It has for longer than I was willing to admit. And I am done being afraid of that." Amy looked up at him through tears she didn't try to hide. She placed her hand on his cheek, the first time she had ever touched his face, and felt the years of tension begin to release under her palm. "It's about time," she said. He kissed her in the garden, under the string lights, surrounded by the people who had watched their impossible story unfold. Max Green kissed his wife for the first time. It was not the kiss of a man fulfilling an obligation. It was the kiss of a man who had been lost for 8 years and had finally found his way home. Dolores started clapping first. Then Marco. Then everyone, a small eruption of applause and laughter and a few tears from people who knew what it had cost this man to get here. When they finally pulled apart, Amy leaned close to his ear, the same distance from which he had once whispered those devastating words at the altar, and she said, "Your heart is safe with me." For the first time in 8 years, Max Green believed it. And that, right there, is the moment I want you to sit with for a second. Because this whole story, from that first shattering moment at the altar to this garden, is really about one question. What do you do with a grief so total that you build your life around it? What do you do when protecting yourself from loss becomes its own kind of loss? Max Green spent 8 years answering that question the only way he knew how, by locking every door, sealing every window, and turning himself into a fortress. And it kept him safe. It absolutely kept him safe. It also kept him dead. And it took a 24-year-old woman who had no reason to stay, no reason to care, no reason to go looking for the humanity underneath the armor, but who did it anyway, to show him the difference between surviving and living. I want to know what you thought about this story. Drop a comment below. Did you see that ending coming? What was the moment that got you? For me, it was the garden bench in November. That was the moment it stopped being a story about a marriage arrangement and became something else entirely. This story moved you, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear that the most closed-off people are sometimes the ones who need connection the most. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We tell stories like this every week, and next week's story, I promise you, is going to hit even harder. Hit the like button if you made it all the way here. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. And I will see you in the next one.